Great. Thank you all so much for being with us this afternoon. We've got a big topic, we've got a fantastic panel, and we've got 26.53 seconds, so we're going to dive right into it. Quick question for the audience. How many of you all have read Bryan Stevenson's book, Just Mercy? Okay, yeah, see hands going up. For those of you who haven't, Bryan is a Supreme Court litigator. He defends people who are in death row, particularly in the Deep South. And in his book, he wrote, "The opposite of poverty isn't wealth, but in too many places, the opposite of poverty is justice." Exactly. And I think very few issues really call out Bryan's point in the way that the issue that we're about to discuss this afternoon, and the use of municipalities and municipal courts of using fines and fees for minor infractions to prey upon low-income and disproportionately poor people to raise and to generate revenue for those areas. And we've got Reverend Starsky Wilson, who was the co-chair of the Ferguson Commission, who spoke to and focused on this issue very, very deeply after the killing of Mike Brown and after the Department of Justice report came out. And then Ann Stuhldreher, who is now the Director of Financial Justice for the City and County of San Francisco, here to talk to us about that issue. So thank you so much for being here with us this afternoon.
Glad to be here.
And Reverend Wilson, I want to start with you, and I want to go back almost 2 years to the fall of 2015. So Michael Brown has been killed. It was a little over a year later. And there were the protests that took place in Ferguson, a lot of heat, a lot of attention on Ferguson and the region and St. Louis. And there weren't federal charges filed, but there was the Department of Justice report that came out, and then the Ferguson Commission that came out, a few months later after the Department of Justice report. For those of us in the room who weren't as deep in the weeds as you were, give us a snapshot of what those reports said about what was happening in the St. Louis region.
Sure. Thank you very much. Glad to be here. Ultimately, I think what we found when we look back at those reports and take them in tandem is that we found that the justice system in the city of St. Louis and Ferguson and the surrounding area, because the DOJ report pointed to other municipalities, really shined a light on the fact that through fines and fees, through pedestrian stops and stop and frisk policies, poor people and police are being robbed of their humanity, and the courts are being robbed of their historic place as the halls of justice in the United States of America. And I say this because the stop that created the encounter between Darren Wilson and Michael Brown was something that only happens to black people in the city of Ferguson by the DOJ report. People who get stopped for a quote-unquote manner of walking in the street, which is what he was stopped for. Originally, only happens to African Americans in that community. And police are disproportionately have to have those interactions because, as we found in the DOJ report, there are incentives from city managers who run these small municipalities to police chiefs to say, we need you to write more tickets to make up revenue gaps. And then the courts, of which we have 90 municipalities, 81 courts, 57 police departments. Fragmentation is a whole nother conversation. The courts are required to make up gaps in the budgets for these small municipalities. And so they become spaces of exchange and transaction, not places where people actually have public safety enforced. And so this entire system creates a perversion and particularly becomes a problem when you add a racialized lens to where this is happening. And so what we see is that it's happening disproportionately in places that are young. It happens to people who are young, black, brown, and poor. And that it's happening in inner ring suburbs, what some have called pocket plantations, where even majority populations that are African American or people of color are overseen by folks with totally white school boards, totally white city councils, as you see in the city of Ferguson. And what we see is that more and more people desire to have a change, and that there are, as you see in the Ferguson Commission report, there have been solutions that have been articulated all throughout the community, all throughout the country, as we look at people's ability to pay, as we begin to look at full-time, full-service courts, as we begin to look at community alternatives, so that this doesn't have to be this way. And when we listen closely to people, I just want to say this one word about police. When we listen closely to the police, we hear, nobody signed up and went to the academy to be armed collection agents. And so when we demean poor people by making them targets that fill city budgets, we also demean the officers that we say we love because they protect and serve us by taking their profession and turning it into something else.
And so everyone is harmed in different ways. And I want everyone in the room to understand that the things that you were talking about are literal. Literally yes. Walking down the street, literally sitting in your car beside a park,
yes.
Literally getting a parking ticket and not being able to pay it immediately and finding yourself in this situation, and literally police officers, judges, and others being in a position where they are looking for revenue. So Lady Justice isn't blind and holding a scale, she's blindfolds off, she's holding a cash register.
Absolutely. And when you end up in jail, because these small municipalities across the nation don't have full-time courts, when you have court once a month, when you end up getting locked up and you don't have the money, you're locked up for 3 weeks. And so there you are for 3 weeks. There are stories of folks sending folks out to the lobby to call and literally dial for dollars, go and get the money. And if you can't, you're locked up for 3 weeks. What happens in 3 weeks? I don't know anybody who's going to hold your job because you're in jail for 3 weeks. And when you've already been on the brink, when you're already living check to check, 3 weeks is a paycheck. And so we begin to talk about those stories and how it pushes people over. And because we have, in our situation, in other places like Baltimore, when we look at the metropolitan area, this hyper-fragmentation, then you also begin to see that day by day, as you go about your errands, you go through a number of municipalities, you go through a number of cities that need the revenue because they don't have the tax base to actually be a city. So we begin to talk about solutions. We can talk about what happens with the officers and we can talk about what happens in the courts, but I think we also have to talk about fundamental restructuring of what local governance looks like, because some of this is just unsustainable.
And I want to get to solutions in a minute,
Yeah.
But Ann, I want to bring you into this conversation, and Reverend Wilson has started to touch on it. I think a lot of people saw the DOJ report, saw what happened in Ferguson, and may have started to believe that, wow, things are bad in Ferguson. Things are bad in St. Louis. But I want you to talk about what you started to see and what you are seeing now that tells us about the scope of this problem.
Yeah, this most definitely is not just a Ferguson problem, and the cash register justice that you describe knows no geographic boundaries. Since 2010, we see that 48 states have increased their court fees and fines. People are charged for a number of things that used to be free and are often constitutionally required. You pay if you request a public defender. If you are sent to jail or prison, you are charged room and board. If you are on probation or parole, you're charged $50 a month, $75 a month. In 30 states, if you can't pay these fines and fees and they're delinquent, your voting rights are restricted. In California and in most states, if your son or daughter is locked up in juvenile hall, you get a bill for every night that they're there, like it's a hotel. You are charged.
Because, Ed, when we were talking earlier, you were saying, surely, when you first started doing this work, surely this isn't happening in California.
Right.
Because California is our big progressive.
Right, that's right. And in most California counties, this is the case with juvenile halls. And parents are also charged for things like mandated alcohol and drug tests. A report came out after Ferguson in California entitled Not Just a Ferguson Problem, finding that 4 million California adults have had their driver's license suspended for not being able to pay traffic court fines and fees. That's 17% of California adults. Think about that. I mean, it's hard to get and keep a job if you don't have a driver's license. And I know, so these things are really stripping wealth and resources from communities that can't afford to lose them. And I know I started thinking hard about this after I got pulled over in San Francisco. I did not come to a complete stop at a stop sign near my house. And I knew from a bunch of my neighbors who'd gotten the same ticket that it was a few $100s. And at the time, I was helping Mayor Gavin Newsom and Treasurer Jose Cisneros start a college savings program, an automatic college savings account for all kindergartners. And I'd been looking at a lot of savings research. And I was looking at this ticket, thinking about the fact that 1 in 3 people in our country are living at or near poverty, and that if this study also had just come out that showed that if 60% of people had to come up with $500 in an emergency, that they simply couldn't do it. So I was looking at this ticket thinking, what happens when people can't pay? Because I know there's so many people out there who can't.
And people can't pay. And at the same time, the incentive for so much of what's happening seems to be that municipalities, urban and rural areas, also can't pay. And this is their way of trying to generate revenue. I'm wondering, given that, what you all are expecting, given the environment that we're in right now. So we are hearing today, this administration, the Trump administration, released their skinny budget. And we're looking at lots of cuts, particularly to discretionary spending. Those things start to roll down, to trickle down. States start to feel it, municipalities start to feel it. So while this problem already exists, the crunch is going to be felt even more deeply in the months and years to come, potentially. What do you think, given what you've seen in the places where you're working, the impact will be on municipalities, on rural townships, and other places?
Yeah, I think we're going to see, well, first of all, some of this I think can be addressed and must be addressed even at state level. I mentioned the hyperfragmentation in our community, and I mention it for several reasons. There are 2 major indicators of segregation, racial segregation in communities. One of them is the number of school districts per 100,000 people. Another is the number of municipalities per 100,000 people. St. Louis is in the top 3 metropolitan areas in the country in both of these categories. So the number of municipalities matters if you care about racial segregation, right? Now, I say that because I think we've got to restructure how we even think about what it means to be a city. When you look in our area, and so we were able to pass a Senate Bill 5, through our state legislature, that begins to get at this, but not directly so, by capping the amount of revenue, the percentage of revenue that can actually come from these small fines, traffic stops, and fees. Because if you can't afford to provide basic services, you probably shouldn't be a city. And so you need to be thoughtful about, we literally have some cities that are smaller than the number of elected officials that we have in the area, right? So there's 753 elected officials. If you add up all of these city councils, there are cities that don't have that many people in them, right? And so if we say that there are basic services that the government should provide, then there should be some basic standards for doing that. Basic standards for having police departments, basic standards, which would get us to some consolidation, and I say consolidation of some of these entities so that they're large enough to be accountable to someone.
Right.
And so I think these are things that you can actually have a bipartisan conversation about, and you can pass through a state legislature that's predominantly conservative with a Democratic governor to sign, because it's a good governance conversation, but it's also a racial equity conversation.
Right. Although you're wresting power away from people in order to do that.
That's absolutely the argument, which is why you're going to have to defend it in court like we've had to.
And I'm very worried about what you just described, that cities and states, I think, are bracing for cuts from the federal government. And historically, what we've seen is that when municipalities, cities, states turn to fines and fees or crack down on their collection, it's when budget times are very tough. I've been working with a professor just to try to track this and see if it's happening, and we are starting to see more and more of it across the country. Cities like Santa Fe, hiring a collections agency to crack down on people who haven't been able to pay ambulance fees. Sycamore, Illinois, El Paso, Texas. Alabama is in the midst of a very aggressive effort to retrieve $400 million in court fees. I think what I would like, though, to say to a lot of these public officials is that they often don't get what they think they're getting when they do this. It's often a practice that is high pain, low gain, meaning that high pain, I think this can really dig people into financial holes that they can't get out of. It sets out this spiral of crazy consequences. You can't pay it, so it gets bigger. Your credit is wrecked. You lose your driver's license, which causes you to lose your job. You can even be jailed in some instances. And it's low gain. It can bring in very little revenue because people cannot pay it. The Vera Institute just did a study of the city of New Orleans who wanted to crack down on people who were not paying their court fees. And they found that the city ended up paying more to conduct this effort than they brought in because they were jailing people and had set up this big apparatus, but the money was just not there. In Florida, the courts estimate that they bring in 9% of the fees that they charge in felony cases. In California, with these, there's a study coming out next week from UC Berkeley looking at these fees in the juvenile justice system. And what they find is that there very often is no net financial gain for the counties. People simply can't pay it. I've been kind of texting and on the phone today with a young man in Sacramento. I'm writing an article that's I think coming out next week. But he grew up in foster care, was in and out of juvenile hall, and his guardian, his grandmother, is now $25,000 in debt, owing to various fees from his time in juvenile hall. And what are we doing there? This is the most important relationship in his life. The purpose of our juvenile justice system is to rehabilitate. These are children, they're young people. And talk about driving a wedge, into the most important relationship in his life, the relationship that's going to be so important to helping him succeed. We've just got this all backwards. This is a lose-lose for government and for people.
And I want to draw this issue out because we've been talking about a lot of cities. We mentioned Santa Fe and other places, but I want to make sure that we don't leave the room believing that this is an urban issue. And if you could talk a little bit more about what you're seeing in rural areas and how people of color in rural areas, how the poor in rural areas are also being touched by the fines and fees that we're seeing in some of the municipalities that you've been talking about.
Yeah, so the original bill that we sought to strengthen with Senate Bill 5 in Missouri was really a speed trap bill. And the speed trap was in a rural town where they knew that people coming back and forth to the state capitol would have to come through there, and they would stop people. And this little municipality had gotten up over 50% of their, so it's a rural town, but they had gotten over 50% of their budget annually from traffic stops and speed, and this speed trap, right? So when we sought to strengthen the bill, it was named after, it was Max Creek, the Max Creek law. It was named after this rural area. And so we see this happening all over the place. I came to know more and more about this after a summit and a conversation with folks in North Carolina. about the number of fees that statewide the courts are putting on people for all of the kinds of things that Ann is talking about. So I think there's no discrimination as far as rural, suburban, or urban. I think it's important for us to also point out the suburbanization of the problem with the suburbanization of poverty, though. So in as much as we've seen that, Brookings Institution and others have pointed to this, we're seeing the price of poverty in that these suburbs are becoming more poor and there's less supports for poor people in those suburbs, but there's more of this balancing of budgets on people through municipal fines, and it shifts. When we passed the law capping it on traffic citations in the state of St. Louis, in the state of Missouri, and specifically in St. Louis County, what we saw was that housing code violations went up. We saw them go up 50% in one of the municipalities literally over the course of a year. In October 2015, ProPublica came out with a study that talked about civil lawsuits and collection suits in predominantly black neighborhoods being increased, and that being another source of preying on people who are already poor. And so we find this through the courts. We find it in civil approaches from quasi-governmental entities, from utilities, from local governments, and we find it whether it's city, suburban, or urban.
It is hard to imagine when I read more and more about this, what it must feel like if you're a resident of one of these communities. It must feel like if I stay inside and close the door, maybe because there were housing code violations, then I might be safe. But your relationship to your community, to the police, everything starts to shift as a result of this. And Ann, I'm curious, given the work that you're doing in San Francisco, and we've talked a little bit about solutions, what kinds of solutions that you're seeing, and what you think might be taken to scale? Because as we've talked about, this isn't a problem that just happens in a few places. This is happening all over the country.
Right. No, I think that's the right question. And I'd say, I want to say that, we're not saying that there should be no consequences. It's just that the consequence should fit, the infraction or the offense. But in some cases, they're so extreme and out of whack, with what's happened. So I'm very proud that in San Francisco, we're the first county in California to stop suspending driver's licenses when people can't pay their traffic court fines and fees. 2 other counties have followed suit. There's Jerry Brown, our governor, has signaled that he wants to end this practice statewide, and in a very Jerry Brown way, called the DMV a hellhole of despair.
In case you missed the point.
Yeah. But in other instances, we're thinking a lot about how can we base these fees and fines on people's ability to pay, and can we right-size them? Like, you think back to that stop sign in my neighborhood where I got a ticket. So if a tech executive, there's a few of those in San Francisco, rolls through it in his Tesla, gets a ticket, and then a woman who works at the daycare center in my neighborhood gets a ticket. It's the same amount, but for the tech executive, it's probably an annoyance. And for the woman who works at the daycare center, it's could be a huge chunk of her weekly take-home pay. And is that really our intention, to mete out punishments that are so different? In a lot of other countries, your fine or your ticket is based on your income. They're called day fines. And there have been several experiments with these in the United States. And one thing I've found interesting in the research and talking to, there's a lot of people actively looking at these right now, is that for the courts, the overall amount of revenue went up that they brought in. And how the researcher was explaining it to me was that if someone gets a $300 or $400 ticket, they're just like, can't do it. Mm-hmm. But if it's $30 or $40, they're like, okay, it hurts, because again, we're hearing from the financial diaries this morning, people have anything unexpected hurts, but they can pay it. And so courts have seen their revenue go up, but the disproportionate impact goes down. We're also thinking, in San Francisco about is a monetary penalty always what makes the most sense? Are there ways, what's our goal really with this fee or fine? What are we trying to achieve? And could people, perform community service in some sort of way? And can we do that in a way that's like accessible and a real valuable option for folks? There's also a bill, in speaking of getting rid of these things, to end these juvenile fines and fees that is going to be introduced in Sacramento next week. And it's high time that, in California, that we really put families before fees and get rid of these things.
Well, as we close out, which, given what we've heard in the last half hour, may sound like a counterintuitive question, but given the work that you're doing now in San Francisco, the report that you worked on, everything that has happened in Ferguson, and the challenge, what is it that gives you hope right now? What gives you a sense of the possibility of what can be?
What gives me hope is the infused kind of energy and enthusiasm of young people around these issues, the knowledge, and the level of discussion around these things. We were pleased that through the commission process, we were able to engage over 3,000 citizens, more than 30,000 volunteer hours, and really use it as an organizing and civic engagement education process, if you will. And now some of those same topics are framing the discussion as we've elected a prosecutor, as we've just about elected a new mayor, and those kinds of things. So I think that ongoing discussion gives hope, and the fact that people are talking about racial equity, people are talking about the impact of systems on people who are poor, and beginning to look at different kinds of solutions. All of the kinds of things Ann has talked about are the recommendations, or the kinds of recommendations that we made, but the fact that we're also getting to spaces to talk about how we restructure and re-engineer how governance happens, and the fact that some of that work is actually moving is absolutely hope-giving, hope-stoking, if you will, for me, and the fact that we're getting to a place and to a space where people are thinking about the impact on people. They're thinking about the stories of those who are impacted, and we see faces on these problems rather than it just being a nameless, faceless policy discussion.
And just 2 seconds as we are.
Yeah, I feel like Ferguson kind of woke us up, but we're not fully awake yet. But when people hear what you said, the stories, like I've been talking to people this week about this young man in Sacramento and his grandmother, who, is $25,000 in the hole. When people hear that story, they're mad. And, I feel like a growing sense of righteous indignation in California that we have to turn this around and that it doesn't work for anyone. It's a bad, stupid source of revenue for cities, and, we're hurting families and people in our community. It doesn't do any good for anyone.
Great. And with that, please help me thank Starsky and Ann.